This month, I'm doing a mystery knit-along called Slipstravaganza. I'm a little late to the party. This is the 11th annual Slipstravaganza hosted by the designer Stephen West, but I'm joining in this year because of the yarn. Holst Garn is a small Danish company that produces beautiful yarn in a rainbow of colors. I first came across Holst at my local yarn store, Wet Coast Wool, here in Vancouver. The colors definitely caught my eye. They're so delicious, but I found the 100% wool yarn a bit stiff and scratchy, so whenever I planned a project that called for this weight of yarn, fingering weight, I usually went with something softer, with more bounce. But back in the spring, I knit a baby sweater for my younger sister, who's having her first child. The pattern she picked was the Tiny Stripes Cardigan by Pearl Soho, which calls for a fingering weight wool that is good for steeking. Holst Garn had many shades of cream and green to choose from, so I went with Nougat and Moorland. And suddenly I got this yarn. I understood it. This yarn is meant for crisp, detailed color work like Fair Isle. It's an accessible version of Jamieson's Shetland yarn, which is hard to get in Canada, and it's stocked in a shop that is 2 blocks away from where I live. The Tiny Stripes Cardigan turned out very well. The yarn was easy to work with and made a lovely fabric, and I started scouting for new projects I could use it for. So a few weeks ago, when I was scrolling through Instagram, I saw a pile of Holst Garn and felt this surge of affection. I love that yarn. Who else loves that yarn? It was Amy Palko, knitter and host of the Meaningful Stitch podcast, and she was using Holst for the Slipstravaganza mystery knit-along. It turns out that Holst is one of the yarns Stephen West is recommending for this year's shawl, and suddenly it's on everyone's radar. I'm lucky to be able to walk over to Wet Coast Wool and play with the Holst colors in person. I had in mind that I wanted a scarf I could wear with my favorite red sweater. Red is a tricky color to match because if one red is cooler with more blue tones and the other is warmer with more yellow tones, then they clash too much for my taste. So my thought was to combine red with orange and pink so that it didn't matter if the reds matched exactly. The staff at Wet Coast are very friendly and helpful, and the first decision they helped me make was whether I would use the Holst Supersoft yarn, which is 100% wool, or the Coast yarn, which is 55% wool and 45% cotton. They had 2 swatches so I could compare the feel and the drape, and the Coast yarn, the cotton blend, was noticeably softer. Since I often wear my shawls around my neck, against my skin, the Coast was definitely my first choice, as long as it had the colors I wanted. So I pulled out all the red, orange, and pink, and even purple that caught my eye. I wanted bright midtones, nothing too dark or too pastel. I also considered using a neutral, maybe a pale gray. I took some inspiration from a favorite bead necklace that I have, and I just tried different combinations to see what I liked most. Slipstravaganza is a mystery knit-along, which means that we don't know what the finished shawl will look like. We'll get the pattern in 4 parts, 1 each week in October, and in the pattern intro, Stephen West gives advice on choosing colors. This year's shawl features a main color and 3 contrast colors. The main color will frame the contrast colors, so it's important that the main color contrasts nicely with all 3 contrast colors. For the contrast colors, I often choose a light, medium, and dark tone. A dark main color will give you a bold graphic effect. My final choice was crimson as the main color, with Saffron, Cherry, and Begonia as the contrast colors. Each skein of Holst Garn costs about $10, and I needed 9 skeins, so the total cost was $90. The first step in starting the project is to knit a gauge swatch. So a swatch is a sample square of knitting to help you make sure that you are using the right size of needles and getting the right number of stitches and rows per inch, because that affects the size and the drape of your finished object. So I started with the recommended 3.5 millimeter needles and cast on using the long tail cast on method. Since you measure gauge over 4 inches or 10 centimeters, I will often take the recommended gauge or stitch count and multiply it by half again to get a little bit of extra fabric on the edges of the 4-inch square. So in this case, we're aiming for 24 stitches per 4 inches, and so I cast on about 40 stitches. I was happy to get this swatch started in time for our weekly family Zoom call, so I had something to keep my hands busy while I was catching up with my parents and my sisters and brother, who all live on the other side of the country. So for a swatch, I will typically knit several rows of garter stitch, which is just knitting every row, and that gives a nice non-curling edge for the swatch. And then I will continue up with stockinette stitch, which is knitting one row and then purling the next row so that you get that smooth traditional knit fabric. And then on both edges I'll continue with that garter stitch, knitting the first and the last 5 stitches of every row to continue to get that nice flat edge. So you can see right here I'm about to switch from knitting to purling. Now typically you would block a gauge swatch before measuring the gauge. That means giving the swatch a bath, suspending it in water, and the water affects the size and also the feel of the fabric. So you want to get as close to your finished fabric as possible. Now in this case, Stephen West gave us an unblocked gauge, so I'm just going to go ahead and measure the gauge without having blocked it first. So this is a gauge measurement tool. I'm going to count the number of stitches. In this case, this is a 2-inch length, and so I'll multiply that number by 2 to get the gauge over 4 inches. Typically, the ball band for the yarn will give you an indication of the gauge, and so you can see for Coast, using 2.5 or 3 millimeter needles, you should get a gauge of 26 stitches per 4 inches. Now, every knitter is different, and that's why you swatch. The 3.5 millimeter needles ended up being too large for me, so I settled on 3.25 millimeter, which gave me a gauge of about 24-25 stitches per 4 inches, which was close enough. Here you can see my first swatch on the 3.5 millimeter needles, but I found the fabric a bit too loose, and the corresponding gauge was also too big, and the feel of the fabric, it felt too sort of lacy and open, and I wanted something a little denser. For my second swatch, I used the contrast colors as well as the main color to see how they interacted. And when I saw the red against the red sweater that I was trying to match, I felt that they clashed a bit too much for my taste. So I also swatched with the orange saffron color as the main color to see what effect that gave, and I liked the results better. So all that remains is one more trip to Wet Coast to swap a skein of red for another one of orange, and to unravel my swatches so that I can reuse the yarn.